A CEO followed his employee home after she asked for leftover food. What he saw that night changed everything. Michael Reynolds had read thousands of employee requests over the years, schedule changes, payroll clarifications, time-off requests. Most were routine, easily processed, and forgotten. But tonight, as he sat alone in his dimly lit office long after the last board member had left, one request caught his eye. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't even a demand. It was simple, almost too simple. Would it be possible to take home any leftover meals after my shift? Michael frowned. The name attached to the request, Sophia Carter. A line cook. She had been with the company for over a year. No complaints. No absences. Always on time. Always the last to leave. Most employees didn't formally request leftover food. If they wanted extra, they either asked a manager or quietly took something before heading out. Why had she felt the need to put it in writing? Michael wasn't the type to get sentimental over employee concerns. He was a CEO after all. His job was to keep the company running, not to get involved in personal matters. But this was different. Curiosity gnawed at him. He pulled up her employee profile. 24 years old. No spouse. No emergency contacts. That was unusual. Maybe she was just frugal. Maybe she didn't want to spend money on food if she didn't have to. Plenty of employees struggled even in a well-paying company like his. But there was something about the way she worded it. It didn't feel like she was just trying to save money. She needed that food. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt something he couldn't shake. A pull. A need to know. He glanced at the clock. 10:47 p.m. Sophia's shift ended at 11. Without another thought, he grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and took the back exit of the building. Michael didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but what he saw that night would change everything. Michael stepped into the crisp night air, adjusting his coat. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few workers finishing up their shifts. Across the lot, he spotted Sophia through the kitchen's back door. She was wiping down the last of the counters, her dark brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail, strands sticking to her forehead from the heat of the grills. Her movements were quick, practiced. She had done this 1,000 times before. A manager passed by, handing her a brown paper bag. She nodded in thanks, tucking it under her arm. That must have been the food she requested. Michael watched as she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and grabbed her worn-out backpack from a hook. Then, without hesitation, she stepped out into the night, heading toward the bus stop down the street. Michael hesitated. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. But standing there, watching one of his employees leave after a grueling double shift, he felt disconnected. He had spent years at the top: private cars, first-class flights, executive lounges. The idea of taking the bus home after 16 hours on your feet, he had never even considered it. And that thought alone was enough to push him forward. Michael climbed into his black sedan but didn't start the engine right away. He waited. Sophia stood under the flickering streetlight, arms crossed, shifting from foot to foot. The bus was late. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance. She stepped onto the bus without looking up. Michael followed. The ride was longer than he expected. At every stop, he thought she'd get off. But she didn't. The further they went, the more unfamiliar the streets became. Streetlights became scarce. Storefronts turned to boarded-up buildings. The city skyline faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by rundown houses and chain-link fences. Michael checked the time. 12:22 a.m. After nearly an hour, Sophia finally pulled the yellow cord, signaling her stop. Michael parked at the far end of the street, keeping his distance. She walked with purpose, never slowing, never looking around. It wasn't a terrible neighborhood, but it wasn't a place you'd want to be alone at night. Then she turned a corner and disappeared behind a row of parked cars. Michael exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't even realized he was holding his breath. He pulled forward slowly, careful not to draw attention. Then he saw it. Not an apartment. Not even a small house. A trailer. Sophia stepped up to the door, balancing the paper bag in one hand as she carefully unlocked it. Inside, a dim light flickered on, casting shadows against the thin curtains. Michael sat in stunned silence. This was not what he expected. And then he saw something that made his stomach twist. 3 small figures emerged from the shadows: children. Sophia barely had time to set the bag down before they rushed her, wrapping their arms around her waist. She laughed softly, exhaustion momentarily replaced by warmth. Michael swallowed hard. They weren't her kids. She was too young for that. Siblings, maybe? Then an older woman stepped into view, frail and slow-moving, hair streaked with gray. A grandmother. Sophia helped her into a chair, speaking softly. She rested a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder before turning back to the food. Michael watched as she carefully unpacked the meal, dividing it onto 4 plates. Not 5. The kids dug in immediately, eating fast like they were used to small portions used to meals being uncertain. The grandmother ate slower, her hands unsteady. Sophia? She sat, smiled, nodded when the kids spoke. But she didn't eat. She pretended, cutting the food into smaller pieces, moving it around with her fork, laughing at something the youngest said. But she never took a bite. Michael's chest tightened. She had given up her own meal to make sure they had enough. His mind raced back to his own dinner that night. A perfectly plated steak at a high-end restaurant. A bill that cost more than she probably made in 2 days. And yet, here she was, working double shifts, only to come home to an empty plate. Michael clenched his jaw. This wasn't just an employee struggling to make ends meet. This was sacrifice. And it made him sick. Michael sat in his car long after the trailer lights flickered off, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. How had he missed this? How many other employees were struggling silently, showing up to work with smiles while their stomachs were empty? He thought about company bonuses, corporate retreats, the thousands wasted on marketing each month. Then he thought about Sophia's mattress on the floor. His fingers tightened around his phone. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed call. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Sir, it's past midnight. Everything okay?" Michael glanced at the trailer one last time. "No," he said firmly. "Everything is not okay." A pause. "What do you mean?" Michael turned the key in the ignition. "We need to fix this. All of it. First thing in the morning." He didn't wait for a response. Because this wasn't a discussion. This was a decision. And he was just getting started. By noon the next day, policies were rewritten. Leftover food? No longer an option, it would be packaged and distributed daily. Wages? Reevaluated and increased. No full-time employee would ever have to choose between rent and food again. An emergency assistance program? Launched immediately. And Sophia? She walked into work expecting nothing to change. Until her manager pulled her aside and handed her an envelope. Inside was a raise, enough to move her family into an apartment. Enough to let her eat without guilt. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to pretend to be okay. Michael had come to work that morning as a CEO. He left as a leader, and he never looked away again.